the paralyzed Korean Mafia boss, fired his janitor for seeing his weakness. What she did next made him weep. Chapter 1: The Midnight Floor. At 2:17 in the morning, the 34th floor of the Kang Group Tower belonged to no one. That was the hour Imani preferred. The hour when the building shed its performance, when the lawyers and executives and assistants with their calibrated smiles had gone home to their separate, comfortable lives, leaving behind only the soft hum of climate control and the blue wash of the city through glass that never slept. At 2:17, the building was honest. And Imani, who had very little patience for dishonesty in any form, found she could breathe here in a way she could not during the day. She moved through the executive corridor with the quiet economy of someone who had learned early that invisibility was a skill, not a flaw. Her gray maintenance uniform was spotless despite the 4 floors she had already cleaned. Her cart rolled without a sound. This was the last stretch, the north wing, the corner offices, the long stretch of pale marble that reflected the city lights like a shallow river. She was halfway down it when she saw him. Choi Yi-won. She knew who he was in the way every maintenance worker on this building's rotation knew who he was, not from conversation, but from the atmosphere that preceded him. The floor that went quiet when his elevator arrived. The way the day staff straightened without being told. The whispered words passed between janitors. 34th floor, last section, don't linger. She had never seen him after midnight. She had certainly never seen him like this. He was in the wheelchair he had never once been seen in during business hours. A sleek, matte black thing. The kind of equipment designed by people who understood that the person using it would refuse anything that looked like accommodation. His tailored shirt was undone at the collar. His jacket was folded over the arm of the chair, with the mechanical precision of a man who controlled small things because large things had been taken from him. His hand was pressed flat against the floor-to-ceiling window, not dramatically, not with the theatrical weight of a man performing his own suffering, just a hand against cold glass, as though checking whether the world on the other side of it was real. He was looking at the city 34 floors below. His face, in the blue-dark light of the empty corridor, held something she had never expected to find on it. The undefended expression of a man who was not being watched, or who believed he wasn't. Imani stood perfectly still. Her professional instinct, refined across 3 years of navigating the invisible geography of other people's private moments, was to retreat silently, to return this section of the floor to the schedule for tomorrow night. She had walked in on crying executives, sleeping lawyers, a CFO who sobbed into his desk at 1 a.m. every quarter end. She knew how to unsee. But her cart had already rolled 1 rotation forward on the marble. A small sound, barely more than a breath, but in the total silence of the floor, it arrived like a dropped stone in still water. Choi Yi-won turned. His eyes found her in less than a second. The eyes of a man whose sense of threat assessment was not impaired by whatever else was. They were dark, and the undefended quality that had been in them a moment before vanished completely, sealed over by something cold and absolute. For 3 seconds, neither of them moved. Imani did not look away. She did not apologize with her posture. She met his gaze with the same steady, quiet attention she'd been giving him since the moment she'd seen him, not starring, not pitying, simply present. Witnessing, which was a different thing entirely from watching. The distinction did not seem to matter to him. His voice was low and controlled, Korean-accented English, each word placed with deliberate weight. Leave this floor, now. She reached for her card. And tomorrow, he said, before she'd taken a single step, do not return to this building. She stopped. You are dismissed. He turned back to the window, presenting her with the exact plane of his shoulder, a gesture of erasure so precise it must have been practiced. Human resources will process the paperwork in the morning. Your final payment will be transferred by noon. Imani stood for one more moment in the pale blue light of the corridor, looking at the set of his shoulders, at the hand that had returned to the window glass. She did not argue. She did not ask why, though she knew why. She did not offer the reassurances that might have softened the moment for him. The "I won't tell anyone," or "I didn't see anything." Because she understood, with the clear-eyed certainty of someone who had spent years studying the human body's relationship with pain and pride, that reassurance was not what this man needed. She turned her cart around and walked back the way she had come. The elevator doors closed on the city's reflection in the marble floor. Chapter 2: What she carried. She had not always been a janitor. This was not the beginning of a complaint. It was simply a fact, one of several facts about Imani that the building's administrative system did not contain and had never attempted to discover, because the administrative system of the Kang Group Tower had, like most systems of its kind, determined everything it needed to know about her from the category she occupied: maintenance, night rotation, provisional. The full facts were these. Imani had trained as a physical rehabilitation specialist at the University of Ghana's School of Allied Health Sciences, graduating with distinction after 5 years of study that cost her family more than they could comfortably afford and repaid their investment with a daughter who could look at a body. At the way it held weight, compensated for pain, protected its own weaknesses, and understand things that could not be seen with the untrained eye. She had spent 3 years after graduation working in Accra's National Rehabilitation Center, specializing in spinal cord injury recovery. The work was the finest thing she had ever done. She had watched people who had been told their limitations were permanent learn to redefine the word. She had sat with them through the worst hours of that redefinition, the hours when the body's new reality stopped being a shock and started being a life. She had learned in those rooms that strength was not the absence of limitation. It was the specific intelligence of learning to move within one. She had come to this city 3 years ago on a fellowship that was meant to last 18 months, partnering with a research hospital on a spinal cord rehabilitation study that represented the frontier of her field. The fellowship had ended on time. The hospital position she had been promised at its conclusion had not materialized. A funding restructure, a leadership change, the particular institutional silence that falls when a system decides it cannot currently accommodate what you are offering, regardless of its value. She had applied to 12 other positions, attended 8 interviews, received 3 offers, each of which disappeared during the credentialing process for reasons that were never fully explained, and which she had spent considerable energy not interpreting as personal. In the meantime, she had bills, and so she had taken the maintenance position at the Kang Group Tower, which paid reliably, required no explanation of her credentials, and gave her the night hours she needed to continue her research applications from the small desk in her apartment, surrounded by journals and the quiet persistence of a person who has decided that the road being difficult is not the same as the road being wrong. She was not bitter about the sequence of events. She had been for approximately 6 weeks, and then she had decided that bitterness was a consumption she could not afford on her budget. What she was, walking home through the pre-dawn city with her dismissal settling around her shoulders like weather, was tired. And beneath the tiredness, alive and precise and undiminished, the understanding of what she had seen on the 34th floor. She had seen it the moment he turned from the window. Not the wheelchair, she had recognized that immediately and filed it as information, not revelation. It was his right hand. The way his fingers moved against the glass as he turned, the specific, compensatory reach pattern of a person managing incomplete motor function in the left side of the body. The way his shoulder had tracked slightly ahead of his torso in the pivot. The tension held in the muscles of his neck, in a configuration she had learned to recognize as the signature of a person performing pain management on a continuous, largely unconscious basis. He was not simply paralyzed. He was in active neurological recovery. Incomplete spinal cord injury, she estimated probably mid-thoracic, probably 2 to 4 years post-incident. And he was managing it alone, in secret, at 2 in the morning, which meant he was managing it without the specific therapeutic intervention that could, in cases of his profile, meaningfully change the trajectory of that recovery. She had known all of this within 40 seconds of seeing his face. And then he had fired her. She understood why. She did not excuse it. Dismissal was dismissal, and she had her rent and her research applications and the particular exhaustion of being made invisible by a system that had decided her category before she opened her mouth. She was not inclined to perform understanding she did not feel. But she understood it. She also knew, with the same clinical precision with which she had read his body in the corridor, what was at stake if he continued on his current path. And that knowledge, unlike everything else she was feeling at 3 a.m. on an empty city street, did not sit quietly. Chapter 3: The Thing She Left Behind. She did not go directly home. She went to the 24-hour diner 3 blocks from her apartment, the one with the cracked vinyl booths and the coffee that tasted like it had been brewed at the beginning of the week and maintained on principle. She ordered a cup and sat at the corner table by the window, watching the city's 4 a.m. shift change, and she thought. She thought about the envelope she was going to send, and whether sending it was professional conduct or profound presumption. She thought about the fact that he had fired her, that her dismissal was not ambiguous or deniable, and that the dignified response to being dismissed was almost certainly not to send your former employer annotated rehabilitation notes in an unmarked envelope. She thought about a patient in Accra, a 38-year-old architect named Kweku, 12 weeks post-injury, who had spent the first 6 weeks of his recovery refusing every form of intervention because, he said, intervention was for people who had accepted that they were broken. He was not broken. He was in temporary conflict with his circumstances. Imani had not argued with him. She had simply sat next to him during each session and described, in careful detail, what the research said was possible, not guaranteed, not certain, but possible for someone with his injury profile who engaged with the correct therapeutic sequence in the first 18 months. She had left him a printed summary each visit. On the 7th week, he had asked her where to start. She pulled out the 3 pages she had been writing on since the diner's coffee went cold. The notes were precise and entirely impersonal. She wrote them the way she would have written clinical documentation for any patient whose case she had assessed, which was, technically, not what this was, but which was the only framework she had for doing what she was doing in a way that didn't feel like overreach. She documented what she had observed: gait compensation patterns, right-hand dominance adaptation, the specific muscular holding patterns that suggested he was managing neurological pain manually rather than therapeutically. She outlined 3 progressive exercise sequences for incomplete thoracic spinal cord injuries at the 2 to 4 year recovery stage, publicly documented protocols, not proprietary, available to anyone with access to the right journals and the training to interpret them. At the bottom, in her cleanest handwriting, she wrote a line of Korean. She had learned it from a colleague during her fellowship, a rehabilitation physician from Busan who had a gift for finding the precise traditional phrase that said what clinical language could not. The line was from an old Korean proverb, and it translated, roughly, as, "The body does not forget how to be whole. It is only waiting to be reminded." She folded the 3 pages into an envelope. She did not sign it. She did not include her name, her credentials, her contact information, or anything that could be read as a demand or an expectation. She addressed it only with his office number, 3401. At 5:40 a.m., on her way out of the building where she had just surrendered her access card, she placed the envelope on the security desk and asked the overnight guard, a quiet man named Patrick who had nodded to her every night for 2 years, to ensure it was delivered with the morning correspondence. Patrick looked at the envelope, looked at her, gave a single nod. She walked out into the morning, which was beginning its cautious, gray-edged arrival over the city, and she did not look back. In the elevator on the 34th floor, at 7:52 a.m., a man in a charcoal suit with his collar precisely fastened opened a plain white envelope that contained 3 handwritten pages and a line in his own language. Choi Yi-won read the pages once. Then he placed them on his desk and sat very still for a long time. His executive assistant, arriving at 8:00 with his schedule and his coffee, found the pages on the desk and the expression on his employer's face something she had no prior data to classify. It was not anger. It was not the careful composure that was his default. It was something older and less armored than either. She set down the coffee and left without being asked to. Chapter 4: The Investigation. Choi Yi-won did not leave things unexplained. It was the foundational principle of how he operated, both in the businesses that appeared in financial filings and the ones that did not. Uncertainty was a resource others could exploit. He did not permit uncertainty. When something landed on his desk that he could not immediately account for, a discrepancy, a variable, an unsigned envelope containing 3 pages of handwritten medical notes in English and a line of Korean that he had read 4 times and had not yet decided what to do with. He gathered information until the uncertainty resolved. The security logs from the night of the incident yielded what he needed inside 30 minutes. The name on the maintenance rotation, the access card surrendered at 5:42 a.m., the single request made to the overnight guard. He had the guard's account by 9:00, the envelope placed on the desk, the civilian clothes, the name confirmed. Imani Asant, contract maintenance, 34th floor rotation, terminated effective that morning. The name, run through his organization's standard background search, produced a file that made him read it twice. University of Ghana, School of Allied Health Sciences, graduated with distinction. 3 years clinical experience, National Rehabilitation Center, Accra, specialization in spinal cord injury recovery. Research fellowship, published in 2 peer-reviewed journals he recognized because he had read everything written about his condition in the first 6 months after the accident and had continued reading after that because knowing was the only form of control still fully available to him. She was not a janitor. He sat with that fact for longer than he was accustomed to sitting with facts. She was not a janitor in the way that the 34th floor of his building was not, at 2 a.m., a place of business, technically accurate, but insufficient. She was a rehabilitation specialist who had been cleaning his floors for 2 years while the medical team he paid to manage his recovery used equipment and protocols that, according to the research she had published, were 18 months behind the current evidence base. He picked up the 3 handwritten pages again. They were clinical, completely dispassionately clinical, the kind of notes a professional writes for a file, not for a person. There was no appeal in them, no plea, no reference to the fact that he had fired her 8 hours before she wrote them. They were simply an assessment and a protocol, offered with the same impersonal precision with which a doctor pins test results to a corkboard. Here is what I observed. Here is what the evidence suggests. Here is the sequence that the literature supports. And at the bottom, in script that was slightly less formal than the clinical text above it, slightly more human, the Korean proverb. He had read Korean from childhood but had rarely encountered that phrase. He knew its origin, not a clinical text, not a modern source. It was the kind of language his grandmother had used, the kind of language that belonged to kitchens and long winter evenings, to the vocabulary of people who understood that the body and the spirit were not separate administrative concerns. He made 3 phone calls. The third was to a number associated with a property management company that had no visible connection to anything bearing his name. 12 minutes later, a man in a charcoal suit was standing in the elevator of a building 4 blocks from the Kang Group Tower, an envelope in his hand. Imani was at her desk, 3 pages of a fellowship application open on her laptop when the knock arrived. She was not expecting anyone. She looked through the peephole, a habit, and opened the door to find a man she did not recognize holding out an envelope with the precise, formal air of someone fulfilling a specific instruction. "Ms. Asant," he said, "from Mr. Choi." She took the envelope. Inside was a single card, the kind of card that was entirely plain except for a private phone number printed in small, clean type. Below the number, 4 words in Korean that she translated slowly, carefully, because her Korean was functional but not native. "I would like to understand." She stood in her doorway for a moment, the card in her hand, and felt something shift in the architecture of the last 24 hours. Not a reversal, not a resolution, but a rearrangement. A door opening that she had not expected to be there. She looked at the man in the charcoal suit. He was waiting with the professional patience of someone accustomed to delivering messages to people who needed a moment. "Tell him," she said in the careful, functional Korean she had, "that I am available Thursday at 2 o'clock. He may come here, or I can come to him." Chapter 5: The Weeping. He came on Thursday at 2 o'clock. He came alone, which she had not expected. She had assumed an assistant, a translator, the architecture of professional distance that powerful men typically constructed around themselves in unfamiliar situations. He arrived in a car she did not see park, knocked on her door without announcement, and when she opened it, he was simply there, in a dark gray shirt and plain trousers, his chair on the threshold of her ordinary apartment, his face holding the careful, deliberate neutrality of a person who had decided, on the way here, to put down whatever he usually carried. She stepped back and let him in. She had cleared the space of clutter that morning without thinking too hard about why, arranged 2 chairs on either side of the low table, and placed the 3 pages she had written at its center. He looked at them when he entered, a single, brief look, and said nothing. She offered tea. He accepted. They sat. "You knew," he said after a moment. Not a question. His English was precise and unaccented, the English of someone educated in it rather than translated into it. "I saw enough to make an assessment," she said. "I've been doing this for 8 years. The compensation patterns are very specific." He looked at his hands on the arms of his chair. "My medical team is using a 2019 protocol." She said it without apology but also without edge. Fact, not accusation. The evidence base shifted significantly in 2022. There are 3 studies, 2 from Seoul National University, 1 from a consortium I was part of here, that show meaningful functional recovery, outcomes for incomplete mid-thoracic injuries when the therapeutic sequence is adjusted in specific ways during the first 5 years post-incident. She paused. "You are within that window. You have, I would estimate, another 14 months in which the interventions in those pages could make a material difference." The silence that followed was the kind that is weight. He had spent 4 years in that silence. She understood this without him saying it. She had sat across from it before in different rooms, with different people. The specific silence of a person who has been told what is possible by systems that then did not make it available to them, who had heard the word recovery applied to their situation, and had watched, month by month, as the definition of that word quietly narrowed until it described something much smaller than what they had first imagined. "Why did you send them?" he asked, "after what I did?" She considered the question the way she considered clinical questions, without performance, looking at it directly. "Because you are within the window," she said. "And I know what it costs when that window closes and someone who could have helped you didn't, because the circumstances were inconvenient." He was looking at her, really looking, the same quality of attention she had seen from him at the window, unguarded, doing genuine assessment. "Show me," he said, "the first sequence." She moved her chair to face him directly. She described what she was going to do before she did anything, which was clinical protocol, and also, she had learned, the thing that mattered most to people for whom their body had become an uncertain country. She demonstrated the first resistance exercise, a hand and wrist progression designed to stimulate neurological pathways in the lower thoracic region through the arms. And then she placed her hands over his and repeated it, adjusting the angle twice, watching the way his musculature responded, reading the information his body offered with the specific, attentive fluency of her 8 years. "There," she said at the third repetition, "feel that." He was very still. She had seen this before, the moment when a body experiences the specific sensation of being engaged in a therapeutic sequence it has been ready for and did not know how to ask for. It was not dramatic. It was almost nothing. A subtle shift in proprioceptive feedback, a change in the quality of effort at the muscle level that the brain processed not as exertion but as recognition. He felt it. She saw it in the quality of his stillness, different from his previous stillness, which had been control. This was something else. This was a man making contact with a possibility he had, at some point in the last 4 years, stopped permitting himself to fully believe in. The tear arrived without announcement. He did not conceal it. He did not produce it theatrically, and he did not wipe it away with the gesture of a man embarrassed by his own emotion. It came, and he allowed it the way he had allowed nothing in this story to simply be, without management, without performance. One tear, in the afternoon light of her apartment, in the middle of an unremarkable Thursday. She gave it the space it deserved. She did not speak. After a moment he said, quietly, in Korean, as though the language held it better, something she translated internally as, "I had stopped believing this was still available to me." She understood the words. She also understood the thing beneath them, which required no translation. "It is still available to you," she said, in Korean that was careful and imperfect and entirely genuine. "That is what the research says. That is what I am telling you now as a professional. You are still within the window." He looked at his hands. They stayed for 2 more hours, moving through the first sequence 3 times, pausing for the detailed notes she made in the file she had begun on his case the night she sent the envelope. The file she had started writing before she knew whether he would ever respond, because she had been trained to document, and she was not going to stop being what she was trained to be simply because a door had closed. Before he left, he spoke for a long time. She listened, and then he asked his translator, a young woman who had arrived quietly at 3 o'clock and sat near the door with professional unobtrusiveness, to convey the specifics. The specifics were these: that the Kang Group's medical division was in the process of restructuring its rehabilitation partnerships, that he had reviewed her published research and found it to be, in his assessment, work of significant clinical value, that he would like to discuss, through proper channels, whether she would consider a consulting arrangement with that division, an arrangement that would involve both her direct clinical input and a broader advisory role in updating the division's evidence base. He paused, and then added one thing directly in English without the translator. "I owe you an apology for Tuesday night," he said. "Dismissing you was wrong. The reason I did it does not make it less wrong." She received this with the same steady, undeflected attention she had given everything else about him. "I know why you did it," she said, "and I know it won't happen again." It was not forgiveness as performance. It was simply the truth, stated plainly, which was the only version of it she was prepared to offer. He left at 4:30 p.m. She stood at her window and watched the car disappear into the city's early evening traffic, and she felt the specific, bone-deep quality of rightness that she had first felt in the rehabilitation wards of Accra and had spent 3 years in this city searching for. There is a version of this story that is about power, about a feared man brought to tears by the knowledge of his own vulnerability. That version is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The complete version is about what Imani did with what she knew. She was not obligated to send those pages. She had been dismissed, which is its own kind of erasure, and the rational response to erasure is self-preservation. She sent them anyway, not because she was selfless, but because she was a professional, and her profession had taught her that the window is finite, and the cost of letting it close is borne by someone who had nothing to do with any decision made in a corridor at 2 a.m. She had knowledge, she used it, that is the complete version. Have you ever possessed something, a skill, an understanding, a truth, that someone needed, but the circumstances said you were not the right person to offer it? Have you ever stood at the edge of a choice between the dignity of silence and the cost of speaking, and had to decide which one you could actually live with? Imani chose what she could live with. What would you choose? Because the window, yours, theirs, someone's, is open right now. And it is not open indefinitely. The hands that held the secret. The end.